Good evening, everybody. Very, very nice to see people who are not following the World Cup this evening. It's so very pleasant to have an evening without football, actually. But if you do hear the scores, do tell me, because I'm quite interested. So welcome once again to the RSM, our series and of interviews. And I'm absolutely delighted tonight. We have Sir Antony Beevor, who I know we often do this, say needs no introduction. The truth is he doesn't need an introduction, so I'm not going to do one. So we can get straight on with
such a relief.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it will come out what you do. But if he writes books, I mean, I think you knew that, didn't you? And you've written a lot of books. I know that you've sold, isn't it 8 million copies?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you bother writing? Why did you bother then writing another book, having already sold 8 million copies? And here it is. So this is the one tonight.
But sometimes you can't stop. I mean, you just keep going. I mean, my dear father-in-law, John Julius Norwich, finished his last book at the age of 89.
Was it any good?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good.
Of course it was.
You have to say that, didn't you? Yes. Yeah. So go on. So let's we're going to kick off then on obviously on the topic of the day, Russia, Revolution and Civil War. I'm going to use a few quotes, not from that book. Mm-hmm. You have to recognize which of your works I'm quoting from. Okay,
oh my God.
To kick off. So off we go. So this is from the first line of another book by you, and it says, "A civil war is not a war, it's a sickness. The enemy is within."
Yeah, Spanish Civil War. Yeah.
Okay, and who's the quote actually from? It's not your quote.
Saint-Exupéry.
Very good. Okay, so
how many points?
No, you get 5 points. Okay, good. Yeah. There's a few more to come though, so don't yeah. Okay, so but when more before we talk about civil war, is it actually a civil war? Because a civil war is within a nation, and this was involved almost everybody.
Well, many of the outsiders involved, like the, say, Japanese, Americans, British, were not actually fighting troops. I mean, they may have got involved in one or two sort of incidents and so forth, sometimes even quite bloody ones, but mainly with sort of guerrillas, or partisans rather, as they were always called then. It was much more a question of it being a civil war, which then became slightly an element of proxy world war. And that came about really because the Supreme Allied Council in Paris found itself in a very complicated position there. Suddenly, 11th of November 1918, the First World War comes to an end, and they're in charge really of the world and setting up frontiers and all the rest of it at a chaotic time. And this was the moment when Woodrow Wilson wanted to stop the Russian Civil War. Churchill wanted to get involved because he feared that the destruction really, particularly of Ukraine and the whole of the production of wheat and all the rest of it, would have a knock-on effect. And he was quite right about that on the whole of the rest of the world and especially on the rest of Europe. While Clemenceau, who was an obsessive anti-Bolshevik, wanted to send in French troops to fight. And of course, that actually turned into the most humiliating expedition of French forces for a very, very, very long time. So one's got to be careful about sort of the external aspects. It's been, I think, on the whole, exaggerated in the past. It wasn't nearly as, say, decisive as the intervention in the Spanish Civil War from, say, the Germans and Italians there.
Okay. You mentioned the French, so we're going to get onto Ukraine in a bit, but as you already mentioned them, how bad were they and where were they?
Well, they were landed at Odessa. And the trouble was that Clemenceau totally underestimated the effect of the French army mutinies of 1917 following the Nivelle offensive, and hadn't realized that things had actually got worse. And therefore you had the mutiny of the Black Sea Fleet, led by André Marty, who was the chief Comintern man in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. And also even the Zouaves and some of their sort of better troops, when advancing right across Ukraine from Odessa, right across all the areas we're reading about now, was suddenly put to flight by Grigoriev, who was basically wasn't really, he was fighting with the Reds, but he was basically a sort of Cossack warlord. And the whole of the French army just sort of ran for it, and then climbed into their boats in Odessa and got out.
Okay. All right, so we're going to switch around a bit here. So at the moment we're in Odessa, but one of the problems of writing about the Civil War is the sheer scale of it. I mean, so from Odessa to Vladivostok, it's 4.5. I actually looked up. It's 4,500 miles.
Yes.
And how can you then tackle a subject where the campaigns, which are complicated enough, are taking place over, was it 12 time zones?
Yes.
4,500 miles. So
yes, 1/6 of the Earth's surface.
1/6 of the Earth's surface, and it's all in one book.
Yes.
So I mean, I just wonder, how do you start? How do you create? Because you are brilliant at creating narratives. How do you do it for something like this?
It's terribly important that you get the skeleton of the chapter skeleton right. I mean, in the old days, I mean, you know, I'm old enough to remember the card index system and the electric typewriter before the joys of the personal computer.
I am too.
When you actually, a book like that would take you at least another 2 years to sort out. And it's above all in the marshalling of the material. So you can get the material from the archives and then you can copy it across without losing it. And that is the only way. But the vital thing is for the reader to make it clear, you've got to follow a strict chronological narrative, because some histories will go do sort of Siberia and then they'll do southern Russia or whatever. And then you can't remember whether you're in 1918 or 1919 and all the rest of it, which is a nightmare, and I hate that. And that's why you've got to have the date or the year on the top of the page and things like that to make it easier for the reader. But I think, you know, I think it's perfectly possible to be able to do it, but you've got to be able to keep the narrative going by respecting the chronology.
Okay, and so you decided not to do it by regions, because that has been done.
Yeah.
And, but equally, but if you were actually in the time, in the period, okay, things were happening that you would not simply know about. So
absolutely, communications were appalling. I mean, you know, it took Churchill sort of 3 weeks to get an answer back, you know, from the British military mission, either down in sort of Rostov on Don, or in Omsk with Admiral Kolchak on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Okay, so in that, so how then do you get over the other problem? It's not you, but I can't remember who said it actually, that history is just one damn thing after another.
Well, I mean, it is, you know, it's a chain of events, chicken and egg, you know, it is one damn thing after another in many ways. But the point is that it is very important that you clarify and explain why one has to have this sort of knock-on effect, because, you know, nothing exists in itself.
Okay, so we've agreed that it's also an international conflict. It's not just but you call the book the Russian Civil War, but it's not just a Russian conflict either.
No, I mean, originally, actually, I wanted to do the book in late 1980s. Covering, you know, the Finnish Civil War and the Hungarian Revolution and sort of and the German uprisings and so forth. And thank goodness the publishers said, no, we've got another idea for you, because actually it was a silly, as a historian, I didn't think I was up to it at that particular stage in terms of experience, but B, the Russian archives hadn't even opened at that stage.
Yeah.
And so thank God, as I say, that I didn't do it then. And but there was a good reason for wanting to do it then, of course, because I think that the British and German historians are absolutely right when they say that the First World War was the original catastrophe. But the Russian Civil War, using the phrase Russian, because frankly, we could call it the Eurasian Civil War if I wanted to. No, but I mean, you know, I think Eurasian tends to throw people a little bit. Yeah. But the Russian Civil War was actually the most influential of all the conflicts, and actually formed the basis of the history of the 20th century, because the knock-on effect, by its cruelty, by its destruction, and sort of horrors, had an effect right across the world, I mean, certainly across Europe. Lenin's determination to annihilate the bourgeoisie and aristocracy affected politics throughout Europe. You see the Spanish Civil War developing that way, with Largo Caballero pretending to be the Spanish Lenin and also talking about the annihilation of the middle class. So the bourgeoisie was terrorized. At the same time, the left was terrorized by the idea of a white counter-revolution, which would crush liberalism and socialism completely.
You could say the same about Paris in 1871, could you not?
Yes, and that's why Lenin always did not want to have any reference to the Communard, because it was a defeat. He didn't mind referring to the French Revolution. And there was a lot of, the whole thing of red and white coming from the red Frisian cap and the white Bourbon cockade. So there was a lot of sort of retrospective stuff to the French Revolution, but on the whole, it's very interesting how they avoided the 1871.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about, the Bolsheviks as a group was they were very well read. I mean, they spent the whole time in the British Museum, didn't they?
Yes.
They kind of came to power, but they were very well aware of their history, of where history was taking them. How did that influence their policies in the Civil War?
I think that they were very conscious of their sort of defeats in the past. And there was definitely sort of an intellectual elitism, and that's why they despised Stalin so much. They thought he was a pockmarked Georgian gangster,
Which he was.
which he was, but they lived to regret, or most of them died to regret, any of the comments they'd made against him during that particular period. But there was no doubt about it that, yes, they were extremely well educated, but at the same time, they knew when it came to the elections for the Constituent Assembly in 1917, that there was no point in trying to win any arguments, because they would go completely over the heads of the vast majority of the Russian population. And so they just concentrated, and one does rather think of President Trump. They just concentrated on little slogans without in any way developing any argument at all. And in fact, in the book I mentioned how it was one of the Rimsky-Korsakovs was sort of sitting in his railway carriage, listening to them practicing their slogans, a little group of activists practicing their slogans. And apparently this was the way to do it, just drum in those slogans, even if they meant very little.
Well, okay. Let me just challenge you a little bit on that, okay? And first of all, I don't want to think about Trump, so let's not think about Trump. Okay. But let's think about them. But those slogans, the whites had no slogans, did they?
None.
But the Reds had slogans that were powerful. I mean, they were powerful. You can't deny the force of them.
They were. No, I don't disagree. Yeah. I mean, if you can come up with all the great things of land and liberty and all the rest of it for the peasants, but of course that was their ideas were stolen from the left socialist revolutionaries, and they had no intention of carrying out any of those promises at all. Because the land was not going to be given to the peasants. It was going to be entirely controlled by the state. In the same way, the promise to the soldiers that they were going to end the war, and he was going to turn it into an international civil war. So, okay. Yes.
And bread didn't do so well in the Ukraine later.
Precisely.
Yeah. But still, I mean, I could say that one or two times in the book, I thought you underestimated a little bit the power of the Bolshevik, not just the rhetoric, but also if you look at what we might call propaganda or images or advertising, and in the pictures in your book, they were way ahead of the whites. They produced really modern images.
Yes, no, they were, and they had some brilliant illustrators and poets and who were sort of helping with slogans and things like that. Bloch and a whole lot of others. Yeah. But no, the whites had absolutely nothing in that particular way. They had no idea of civil administration. They had no idea of propaganda. In fact, they were far too arrogant to believe that they needed propaganda. As far as they were concerned, getting rid of the Bolsheviks should be enough for anybody. And in the case of the whites, if one's talking about the volunteer army or whatever, for most of them, it was either restoration of the Tsar or the restoration of a Tsarist type regime or military dictatorship. For the Cossacks, it was basically anti-Semitism and any opportunity going. I mean, the only civilized ones actually were the Komuch, who were actually right socialist revolutionaries and sort of slightly moderate socialists. So it was a totally improbable alliance, which was never really going to work.
Yeah.
And actually, funny enough, it was in the worst proportion to the Spanish Civil War, where you have on the left, you have a sort of pretty chaotic and alliance. But the great advantage of Franco was to have a unified command, just as Lenin had a unified command in the Russian Civil War. So it was all reversed in that way.
Which would you then put the greater importance on, the way that the Reds were all got more organized,
yes,
and created a Red Army force, or the role of the ideology? Because you would have to be, who would have supported the Whites compared to the Reds at that time? I mean, you mentioned some of their good bits almost. I mean, they were worse than that, weren't they?
Well, to give a very good idea, I mean, for example, when it came to the volunteer army struggling in the Caucasus in the winter of, the beginning of 1918, and the Ice March and all the rest of it, most of their battalions were made up entirely of officers. They had hardly any soldiers. It was the most overgeneraled force which has been ever put into the field. And of course, you know, there were all these useless old retired generals who had sort of joined up, hoping that they were going to be given a sort of governorship somewhere. And in most cases, they were going to use that governorship to earn as much money or steal as much money as they possibly could to, basically, to, I suppose, soften their exile.
Yeah, so I mean, some of them were barking mad, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, total psychopaths, sociopaths, whichever. I mean, you know, when you think of people like Skuro, and as for Unger and Sternberg, I mean, you know, unfortunately, that was one chapter I had to drop out at the end. It was getting a bit long, but there was a final chapter on the Baron von Unger and Sternberg, who was so barking mad, it was terrifying.
Tell us a bit more. Come on, tell us what you didn't put in then.
Well, I mean, you know, if an officer irritated him at all, he had to climb a tree and stay up there all night. As for anybody else, if they captured a communist or whatever, he was burnt to death. I mean, and as for his anti-Semitism, I mean, it was literally, I think he made even sort of Heinrich Himmler look at moderate. So, I mean, you know, it was, I mean, quite staggering.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he was a Buddhist and had gone really sort of completely, I don't think one was, I'd say, gone completely native, or he's gone completely indigenous or whatever in Mongolia at that particular time. I mean, he wasn't a rather remarkable man, but absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and then you mentioned Skuro, another
who was finally executed at the end of the Second World War, handed over by the British to Stalin in Carinthia, along with most of the Cossacks and so forth. I know that Count Tolstoy was sort of always a tremendous defender of them all, but actually most of them were accused of war crimes in Italy and Yugoslavia and elsewhere, and Skuro was among them. Krasnov perhaps didn't deserve to be killed, but he was another Cossack leader who was executed as a result afterwards.
But he was still recruiting for the German White, along with Vlasov and co.
Oh yes. No, I'm not saying he was a cuddly character. No.
Who was the one who had a bird cage and went to war with a crow in his bird cage?
Oh yes, well that was Slashrev.
Another bonkers.
Oh yes, totally bonkers. But funny enough, they usually tend to be brilliant cavalry leaders.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, my grandfather went off to war in 1914, and his Yeomanry regiment, and they all had their fighting cocks in cages attached to their saddles.
Really?
Yes, in 1914. Yes, right. Northants Yeomanry. Yes.
They wouldn't have lasted long in battle, would they? Or
well, they at least could be eaten.
Oh, I see. I had an image. I was just thinking suddenly of what's he called, Gavin Williamson in his tarantula.
Yeah.
Something like that. That's also not a nice image. So okay. But then on the other side, so on the Reds, I mean, tell us about some of the characters there. I mean, the one I did not know about at all, but you know, I always kind of half fell in love with is Larissa Reisner.
Oh yes, well, I mean, I think that her account is I mean, she was an extraordinary woman. I mean, unbelievably brave.
Yeah.
At the same time, one's rather dubious about her memoir or whatever. She was absolutely besotted with Trotsky, so that wouldn't. I don't think she'd have survived the 30s. as you might imagine. But no, I mean, what the fighting on the Volga, and especially around Kazan and so forth, was remarkable. I mean, Trotsky at that particular stage was, he loved the dramatic entrance, and so he'd turn up with his armored train. I think in Dr. Zhivago in the movie, you know, very much sort of a Pasha Antimov, played by Tom Courtenay, right, was very much sort of based on Trotsky in that particular way. And so he would turn up with the armored train, and even with a sort of an aircraft disassembled in one of the carriages and ready to sort of take off. But at that stage, he despised cavalry because he regarded it as very aristocratic and old-fashioned. And then suddenly they found, well, actually, they did need cavalry, and especially with such huge distances to cover. So it was a railway and cavalry war. But then we had the wonderful thing whereby even Trotsky had to come out with this, again, going back to advertising campaigns, you know, proletarians to horse, which I thought was such a wonderful sort of communist slogan to come up with.
I know that one, yeah. And they had some, I mean, they had some very famous cavalry commanders, the Reds.
Well, the most famous, of course, was Bourdieu, who was a thug of the worst order, and of course one of Stalin's great cronies, along with Voroshilov and.
Yes, that is true. But like some of the other bad characters, they were all, some of them had amazing physical courage. Bourdieu had.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I wouldn't underestimate that. But you know, you can have, shall we say, on the whole, I think one can, as a generalization, say that those with tremendous physical courage often have very little moral courage. It's very rare to get the two together.
Or very little brains, maybe like Ney or something. Yeah. Do you think there's a kind of, like, there can't be an inverse correlation between courage and brains, or is there?
Some people would say yes, in terms of lack of imagination.
Yeah.
But some can be extremely intelligent, some can be extremely, I mean, Evelyn Waugh, absolutely fearless. But in that particular case, you suspect he had a death wish.
Oh, right.
Well, the way in Yugoslavia that when this Messerschmitt was coming in, sort of machine gunning their airfield, Waugh just walked out onto the runway and sort of just shaking his fist at it, which, I mean, it's about the least logical thing to do.
Okay. That takes we could go on to Crete at this point.
No. Let's try and stick to
let's stick to Russia.
The Central Axis.
Yeah, okay. But I've now completely lost the track of what I was about to ask you next.
Sorry, my fault.
No, it doesn't really matter. But so let's still think. Actually, no, there was something you just said then I just want to take up then again. Now you said that the Russian Civil War is one of the most momentous conflicts of the 20th century, and I wouldn't
influential,
yeah. Now, but you also say in the book, you say correctly that obviously the whites were in the end incompetent, useless, they didn't,
corrupt.
But you end your very last phrase is you think the Bolsheviks were at times, I can't remember the word I think, did you say call them diabolical?
No, well, no, that was, this was Scott's parallel with the old Russian folktale about the Devil's Apprentice. No, I mean, in the very last phrase, I basically said, you know, the whites provided some of the worst examples of humanity, but when it came to inhumanity, the Reds could not be beaten.
Okay. I mean, I just want to just explore that a little bit, because I mean, there are times when it'd be very hard to, we talk of the Ukraine after we've had a break with the audience a bit, to modern Ukraine, but some of the things that were going on in the Ukraine, you know, that Denikin, when he takes Kiev, manages to kill 20,000 Jews in one day. The Bolsheviks never did that.
I don't think that there was. No, it was at Ekaterinburg where there were 2,200 were killed by the whites. But not in Kiev.
I thought there was a huge pogrom there when Denikin first arrived.
Well, there was a pogrom when they were leaving.
When they were leaving, okay.
But it wasn't as much as 20,000.
All right,
I mean, okay, overall, yes, the figures were terrifying. I mean, we're talking about 150,000 altogether, I just said.
Okay, yeah, I think
no, Anne Applebaum went into it quite well in her book on the Red Famine,
Yeah, I think I've confused it with Baba Yar, haven't I?
Yes, yeah. Well, that was 30,000.
Yes, so I have. Okay, but nevertheless, when the whites arrived in your village, if you were in a shtetl somewhere in the Ukraine, this was unbelievably bad news. I mean, you know, it was the...
No, it was actually when they were leaving that it was
Okay,
unbelievably bad news. I mean, there would be a lot of looting and a lot of sort of beating up or whatever, but the real killing came out of the anger and bitterness of defeat, and that's when the worst of the pogroms were.
You quote a white officer in the Ukraine saying, feeling of disgust, of self-disgust. When he says,
Yes.
and this is when they're arriving. He said, well, the first thing we did, we hanged all the Bolsheviks, and then and the Jews together, and then we raped all the women. And he just said that's what we did in every village as we went through. Now, I can't quite see why you would say the Bolsheviks were worse. I mean, they were evil. Not. You know, you'd say that I'm not quite sure why you think that they were on a different, lower moral plane than the whites.
I'm talking about the total, well, here what you've been describing quite rightly is, I'd have said, the worst examples of humanity.
Yeah.
In terms of the Bolsheviks, and particularly with Lenin, when one is talking about the massacre of a whole class, basically class genocide, then I would have said in terms of inhumanity, where there is no question of any form of respect for life or of justice. You know, even people who had been, say, good landlords or who had actually behaved quite well, there was no mercy for them either.
Yeah. No. Okay. Fair enough. So there was the element of class war.
Yes, and what's very striking is the way that in 1948, when it came in the United Nations, when it came to the whole question of the definition of genocide, the Soviet Union fought very, very hard to make sure that the class genocide was not included under that particular article.
Yeah. And or indeed that nobody would talk about Katyn.
Or of course would talk about Katyn or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I suspect you don't subscribe to the view of some historians that things might have been better. You know, I think with Churchill who said Lenin's birth was Russia's greatest tragedy, but then the second greatest tragedy was his death, that he might have kept the state together in a different way.
Well, the great myth of Lenin, of course, arose, and as did the personality cult, in the summer of 1918, after Fanny Kaplan managed to put 2 bullets in him. And especially the one in his throat or neck. And that's when suddenly sort of, you know, the people would cut out photographs of Lenin and put them up in their, what had been their holy corner in their izba and so forth. And Bolshevik propaganda portrayed him as a secular saint. And of course, that persisted very much throughout the whole of Russian history of the 20th century. And it was only when General Volkogonov, at the time of Perestroika and Glasnost, was allowed into the presidential archive, into the Presidium archive. And there, of course, he, with extraordinary honesty, showed actually that all of the horrors of the Stalin era were already established in advance, whether it was the Cheka, whether it was the Gulag, and the horror of the camps in the north. Of course, it had all been established under Lenin.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point and found. I mean, the other thing is that the Russians kept the communists, the Reds, kept very good archives.
Yes.
Rather foolishly, you might think, but do you think
they never expected them to be looked at? And this is why it was so astonishing when Luba and I went into the archives for the first time in Podolsk, and Pikoya, who was the Minister of the Archives, had, under Yeltsin, had forced the military to open up their archives. And, you know, the colonels and so forth in charge of the archives simply didn't know how to handle it. You know, they were very sort of nervous. And here one saw this sort of curious Russian contrast of sort of paranoia, then followed by naivety. So to begin with, they would search everything and sort of, you know, our papers and all the rest of it. And then suddenly they'd leave us in another room without any supervision whatsoever. When a lot of the stuff that we were given, we were supposed to be completely secret and we weren't allowed to look at it. So, I mean, you know, it was very confusing in a way, but they were confused, we were confused.
Yeah. So, but I mean,
it's a little bit like playing scissors, paper, stone. You know, when you got blocked in one archive, you could quite often find copies which had been sent to another, department, and you could find them elsewhere.
It must have been unbelievably exciting to have been there at that time?
It was quite nerve-wracking. I was quite nerve-wracking. There's the ghastly Prigozhin, who's in charge of the Wagner Group. But I had to say, I was rather grateful to him at the time, because the food in the archive canteens was so disgusting.
Oh.
And Prigozhin was selling these rather good hot dogs at $1 a piece, which no Muscovite could afford at the time. But I stuffed my face with them. And after that,
is that the same guy?
Yes,
Oh,
this was Putin's chef. This was back in 1994-5. Yes.
We'll keep Putin out of it just for a little bit.
Yes, please.
We will come at it slightly, but go on. What? Yeah. Any other? I mean, it must have been just for a historian to be, in at the start of something like that.
No. Well, I mean, my great friend Stéphane Courtois, who wrote the Livre Noir du Communisme, he was a tremendous help in those early days of sort of giving advice and all the rest of it. And and going back to what you were saying about the sheer quantity of material, with his whole team from Sciences Po, they reckoned that they'd need almost 20 years just to go through the material of the French Communist Party, which was all in Moscow, because the French Communist Party was not allowed to keep it back in Paris.
And did that also, when you were there, did that give you the idea? No, because it's after, isn't it? There's a lot of Spanish archives in there as well.
Yes.
I can't remember the chronology of your books, actually, which
I can't either.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we'll give up. But could you also get stuff that you would say, I'm going to use that in the next book, or?
Well, yes, sometimes, if you did, but on the whole, thank God. I mean, because obviously, if you're covering a large period of time, I mean, it's huge, and the advantage of, say, a subject like Stalingrad was at least it was focused geographically and in limited in time.
Okay. Now another quote. Okay, see how you do on this one. You're doing very well.
Okay.
So next one is again you. Well, it's not you, but it's the opening of another book. This time, Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone.
Stalingrad and Chuchev.
Okay,
right,
very good, well done. But what does that mean, though? Actually, I wonder explain why that's the opening quote to Stalingrad.
It's trying to emphasize the way that the Russians, and not just communists or anything like that, believe so intensely in the Russian soul, the Russian mind, which can therefore detach itself from the physical reality. So even if they'd faced defeat, somehow there would be a moral superiority of one sort or another. And one finds this very much in Putin's propaganda. I'm afraid, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. It'll come in eventually.
It's going to come anyway. But the whole notion of Dugan, whose daughter was blown up in that car, who, although Putin doesn't accept all of his ideology, this ideology actually comes from the white exiles, not from the Reds or the Red winners. But this idea of Holy Russia, it's actually sort of Tolstoyan idea in some ways of the Orthodox Church, Slav nationalism and all the rest of it. It does see a sort of ability to rise above the appalling circumstances that you're in and eventually achieve some sort of victory in the future.
This is what Timothy Schneider calls the Russian politics of eternity that they believe in, and which does take us now to the Ukraine.
Absolutely. Well, Tim is brilliant in that particular way. Absolutely. Yeah.
So to just push that a little bit further as to what that means in terms of the modern situation now that we have.
Well, I'm afraid in brutal terms, it means that there is a Russian belief in, as I say, their spiritual superiority, and therefore a justification in imposing that on not just the surrounding areas, but I mean, in Dugan's ideas, all the way from Vladivostok to Dublin. I know,
Dublin,
not Lisbon, but Dublin. But anyway, so this idea is actually the only other time it's really happened actually was with the Nazis believing that they could impose their view. So to what degree it's a corresponding attitude or not is a different matter. But I think that is very much sort of in a way, their justification. And also, I mean, it has played a part, I think, in some of his strategic thinking, if one can call it that, the idea that sort of whether it's homosexuality or whatever it might be in the West, which is tolerated, shows that we're completely corrupt and fainéant and useless. And all of this, of course, was further emphasized by the catastrophic and disastrous retreat from Afghanistan. Yeah. And this is where Putin thought, right, this is definitely, this is the time to go, this is the opportunity.
Yeah.
But again, it was this question again of moral superiority.
So, and for him,
which coming from a gangster like Putin, it's really pretty rich. Yeah.
Well, true. There are a lot of ironies there, aren't there? But there's also something very serious and quite frightening about it. We know that he thinks that he wants to restore the Russian Empire.
Yes.
You know that. But so let's just go back then to the Civil War and how successful they were in doing that, because obviously in the end Ukraine becomes part of the Soviet Union. Although it didn't have to be that way, did it? I mean, there was some.
Well, Putin tried to argue that Lenin was responsible for the loss of Ukraine, which was ridiculous. What in the end, and in December 1917, Lenin understandably did not want to see the Bolsheviks stereotyped as Russian chauvinists.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why he made his declaration on self-determination. What he misunderstood was the possibility that the White Finns, with German support, would actually manage in their civil war to extricate themselves from the Russian Empire. Though technically they weren't part of the Russian Empire, but anyway, that was always rather complicated. But the Ukrainians simply were not in a position, they had no forces to be able to liberate themselves. And in any case, Muraviev and his one small Red Army was already heading towards Kiev, and the other one was heading into the against the Don Cossacks and Rostov. So there wasn't really any chance at that particular point. So to blame Lenin for that, as Putin attempts, is ridiculous.
Okay, I didn't know he'd done that actually. Mm-hmm. And the Commissar for the Nationalities was our friend Stalin.
Later on, yes, absolutely. Yeah, yes.
But so, I mean, people may think, I thought Finland was part of the Tsarist Empire. But...
Well, funny enough, no, it was the Grand Duchy of Finland, which belonged to the Tsar, but had nothing to do with the Russian state. It was a very curious thing after complication of that period of the post-Napoleonic War.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, but it was still pretty much, it was in the Russian sphere of influence, yeah. So why did the Finns then, as a military person, so how come the Finns were able to resist that and gain their independence, and indeed keep it in 1940?
Well, the Russian troops, or the Russian troops in Finland at the time, even though there were quite a lot of them, were completely demoralized. Some of them sympathized with the Finns, not obviously on the whole with the left-wing Finns. And the Whites, though, had support. They'd sent, I mean, the Finns had always been sort of anti-Russian. And there was the whole business of the Tsar's imposition of Russification in the last decade of the 19th century. And the Finns had reacted against this. And when the First World War broke out, some of their young, wanting to take advantage of this, went to Berlin and volunteered and joined the sort of Jäger battalions. And came back and actually were very effective leaders. And they also had General Mannerheim, who was a former Tsarist commander from the Chevalier Guard and so forth. And the Reds in Finland, in fact, had no weapons, really. They would raid country houses for hunting rifles and so forth. And then, of course, you had the General Volder-Goltz and the Baltikum division, which was sort of shipped across to Finland. And so, you know, they had, shall we say, a rather effective military organization.
And again, just to keep the theme going, we forget about that, but it was also a very bloody civil war.
Yes.
And a massive white repression.
Oh yes, massive white repression. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, I cite the numbers killed or who died. Actually, the worst of all was being taken prisoner, and many of them sort of starved or froze to death in the camps afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, can I ask you, does it get you? You can't. I mean, it's not really a good question to ask a historian, but it's such a grim story in all ways, with very little redeeming features. Does it get you down? I mean,
Yes, it does. I mean, I suppose in a way, I think it was much earlier on. I mean, with doing the Stalingrad book, particularly with Luba, and I remember, for months afterwards, and sometimes it would still come a sort of flashback. You look at a plate of food and think how much that would have meant to 10 people or whatever in Stalingrad, and how people survived. I mean, there were 10,000 civilians who were still alive in that city at the end, of whom at least 1,000 were children who'd been living off roots. And to give you an idea, shall we say, of inhumanity, some of the children of the Russian Stalingrad children would be tempted by German infantrymen with a crust of bread to go and fill their water bottle in the Volga. And the Soviet snipers were ordered to shoot them down. That was how pitiless war was.
Yeah. I'll take a break. So for a few questions, just because, and then we'll talk a little bit about yourself actually. But any questions at this moment in time? Try and yeah.
You mentioned that the whites band Bolsheviks, many of the members of the Red Army, on their personal level, they were terrorists. They were fighting for their territory. And you say that most of the massacres, Jews particularly, when they were leaving. But the evidence I have, certainly with St. Laura in Ukraine,
Yes. But Petliura was not a white.
No,
Yeah.
he was a Ukrainian nationalist,
Yes.
but he helped them. And Balachovitz, with the volunteer army in southern Belarus, was responsible for many pogroms and massacres. My father's family, particularly, was one of the shtetls, the villages, which has been listed, where they were slaughtered by Balachovitz. This often turned people, Jews particularly, into Bolsheviks overnight. So even amongst the Red Army, there were members who were from the Bund who were fighting for the Reds, not knowing eventually what the Soviet Union would become. So on the ground, I think there were many massacres by the whites, and Balachovitz, who, as you know, was changed sides so many times.
Oh yeah. Well,
And so would you say that is a fair estimate of what I'm saying, that it wasn't, sometimes they did it for the sake of doing it. They were often irregular troops, but they slaughtered Jews, less by the Russian Orthodox Church in that respect.
But I think you'll find that the words, as we were saying earlier, there was a lot of beating up and looting when they arrived, but the real killing came towards the end. I mean, this is what one gets continually in most of the accounts by both sides. And in the case of the Reds, I mean, what was so extraordinary was how many of them in the Red Army would actually also beat up the Jews on the grounds that even little market traders who are totally impoverished were bourgeoisie. So, I mean, it wasn't just a question of the whites. I mean, obviously the whites were the worst and the Cossacks were the worst of the whites. Of that, I think there's absolutely no doubt. But I mean, nobody has got sort of, detailed figures really of the time. And the great New Zealand journalist who was working for the Times, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name at the moment. He said the trouble is that sort of, one can't trust really any of these figures at all because, everybody is exaggerating, whether it's the victims or the perpetrators. So, I could only quote the figures which came in from the Soviet archives.
Okay. Just one little thing I may say. Ironically,
yes,
Balachovitz, as you know, managed to carry on until the Second World War. But he was a man who ended up being a military advisor to Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And my father was in the British battalion in the Spanish Civil War.
Oh, right.
So it went round in a big circle. Thank you anyway for your reports.
Okay. Yep. Can you just wait till we get a mic to you, because the acoustics aren't fantastic. We are recording this, and we won't pick up your question without a mic. Gentleman there.
Thank you. A slightly more general question, if I could. I've read a number of your books, not the most recent one. They're what I would call, in the simplest form, old-fashioned narrative history, and none the worse for that. The question is, was there any previous historian or form of history that you took as a model for your books as being, as I say, very high quality, but narrative history?
Well, I mean, we all owed a great debt to John Keegan for, if you like, turning military history upside down by looking at the experience at the front rather than seeing it from the view of the staff officer. Also very much influenced by Michael Howard, who quite rightly argued, you shouldn't be a military historian, you should be a historian of war. Because you should be covering, you know, the refugees, the families affected by war in every form, and also the ordinary soldier who had no control over his own fate. But this was followed, it was quite interesting, because I think in the 1980s there was a great fashion for oral history. And I was never really convinced by oral history because it lacked the context. And, you know, you could have collections of diaries, of letters or whatever. And publishers, I think, on the whole, tended to agree with that. And I found out already before Stalingrad, I was sort of working in that direction of trying to impose or trying to join history from above with history from below, because particularly as we were into a post-military society, a health and safety environment, one needed to convey the reality of the horrors of totalitarian warfare and totalitarian life, I think, to a younger generation. And it seemed to be the right way of doing it. And I mean, I think it was a question of sort of timing in that particular way. That sort of, you know, Stalingrad came out just at that particular moment. But I think that history in the past had always been tended to be written from a sort of top-down version, in a collective version. And at a time, this was at a time when people were suddenly much more interested in the experience of the individual. So if you could combine the two, it seemed to work rather well anyway.
Okay. Now I recognise Major General Reeses there. I think that is you, wasn't it? Yeah. And I think did you want to ask a question? Can we just get a mic as well, or we'll repeat the question?
Oh God, I'm going to be on the camera.
Yeah, you'll be on the camera. It doesn't matter.
No, I was simply interested to know whether there is any evidence that Arthur Ransom, who spent much of the First World War in Moscow and ended up marrying Trotsky's secretary, was in fact a British spy.
I don't think that one actually has been completely. I'm trying to remember the biography of Ransom, which came out in about the 60s or 70s. No, 1980s or whatever. Yes, that's right, Broken. Yes, a very good biography indeed. And the awful thing is, it's such a long time since I read it that I can't remember what his final conclusion was. So I'm afraid we'll have to look that one up later.
I mean, there are some. I mean, there is a. I think there's been films. I think there were British spies hanging around. Some of them fairly romantic and glamorous. But did they actually do anything?
Well, there was Paul Dukes, who was an extraordinary character. He was there at the Finland station when Lenin arrived, and was an extraordinary brave man. Entirely run by SIS and Cumming, and obviously managed to get a lot of information out and so forth. Anyway, and he was sort of knighted, but he was knighted secretly. Oh. Which I don't know whether that was an advantage or a disadvantage. But,
Great. Okay, and at the middle there, and then we'll switch to the left. Yeah.
May I ask you about translations of your work, and in particular how they've been received in Russia? Because I seem to remember some problem at some point. I think it was with Ukraine. How much?
The Ukrainian business was ridiculous. It was.
And how much control do you have over translations? And are there any plans to translate your new book into Russian?
Well, sadly, Azbuka Atticus, who are my Russian publishers, 2 days after the invasion of Ukraine, were saying, can we now sign the contract or whatever? And I would be delighted. I knew perfectly well that, with sanctions coming up and all the rest of it, wouldn't be a question of ever getting paid a penny. But of course, the one thing I'd love to have had would have been a Russian translation of the book. But I'm afraid my agent said, well, we can't do it because of sanctions.
Yeah.
So, I'm afraid that was cut off there. No, but the problem with Ukraine was a silly one. It was, as Bucharatigas did do a special edition for the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass and all the rest of it. They had, the translator had translated when I was talking about the Ukrainian militia who'd worked with the Germans in 1941, they refused to translate that as militia because they said in Russian that of course means police. And so they translated it as a Ukrainian nationalist. Well, anyway, I was condemned by some fairly well-known character in Ukraine. I can't remember exactly who. It was the sort of head of their sort of television at the time for this. And then I found myself in the ridiculous position of being supported by the Russian embassy in London, where technically I was liable to 5 years imprisonment under the Sergei Shoigu's law against anybody who'd insulted the Red Army because of the Berlin book. And the whole question of the mass rapes. The Russian ambassador, before the book came out, had invited me to lunch. I got this rather sinister telephone call inviting me to a vodka lunch because he wanted to find out exactly what was going to be in the book. And what he was trying to get across, and actually he was right in a way because I underestimated it, was that the fact that the sacred nature of the victory in May 1945 was obviously undermined. Its sacred nature was undermined by what I was writing about the mass rapes. And the fact that, of course, it came from their own archives made them that much angrier. And so that was why I became known as the chief slanderer of the Red Army.
Well, yeah, it was all true.
It was. No. There it was in black and white in their own reports. Yeah.
So, are you persona non grata then in Russia? Can you
I am liable to 5 years imprisonment. In theory, I don't think that would necessarily happen, but I'm not going to go for a holiday on the Black Sea.
No, don't do that. I don't think we could cope with that. Okay. Anybody on my left, apart from Roger? All right then, Roger. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Antony, for coming tonight. But we were talking before about Luba. I'm not sure.
Luba,
yeah. Not your assistant, but your sort of co-worker for so many years.
Colleague for 28 years. Yeah. Yes, we worked together.
Just tell us a little bit about the way that you work together, because it seems absolutely central to what you've achieved.
Well, it was fantastic. At the time, I knew perfectly well. I first worked in the archives in '92 when Artemis and I were doing the Paris After Liberation book. And I realized then that there was just such a sheer quantity of material. But unless you could actually speed read in Russian, you were never going to be able to cover the ground. And I knew perfectly well that, even if I worked flat out in learning Russian or whatever, it would be totally inadequate. So there's no point fighting it. And various friends sort of were making suggestions about, we usually find you a young Russian historian who would love to work, because it was a really bad time for them, and they desperately needed the work. And then a great friend who was living in Moscow at the time, sort of English, married to a Russian, said, my husband's got this first cousin. He said, she's a bit fey, but I don't think she'll work or whatever. Anyway, Luba turned out to be absolutely brilliant. She was doing her doctorate in plant biology, which I said, perfect. I didn't want to have a historian.
No.
And
you can't trust them.
Well, no, particularly, I'm afraid, on sort of sensitive subjects. And so that's how we started. And she was only, as I say, was only 21 at the time. And we started by going off down to Volgograd together. And it was fantastic because Luba had exactly the same sort of instinct towards material or stories or whatever it might be as I did. Also, she was brilliant when it came to dealing with crusty old colonels or the dragon ladies in the archives, who normally, you know, had no sense of humor whatsoever. But Luba had a secret weapon, which was that she had a stammer. And when she stammered, her eyelids sort of fluttered. Oh. And this raised things, oh, Lubushka, Lubushka. They got sort of terribly paternal or maternal or whatever. We managed to get away with quite a lot that way. I would stay in the background and let Luba get on with it. It was brilliant.
Oh, gosh, okay. And one last one. Anyone? Okay. Let me ask you one then. Let's go back to the present then. Mm-hmm. Given that, despite everything, in the end, you know, that they created a Red Army that did eventually finally win the Civil War, which probably was always going to happen, and the great, you know, patriotic war. Are you surprised at how bad they've done in the Ukraine?
No, for a number of reasons. One of the things one has to remember, quickly going back to the Civil War, was that most sides, the manpower simply came from prisoners. And I mean, basically, you know, they were given a weapon, or if they still had their own weapon, they said, right, okay, you're fighting for us now. And so they then try and desert the next opportunity. So to talk about sort of too much idealism, you know, the commissars didn't really have much of a chance to do that much more propaganda until the very end of the war. But the similarity especially goes back way beyond before the revolution, I mean, into Tsarist times, was basically how badly they always treated their own soldiers. I mean, soldiers were treated like serfs, and of course, most of them were serfs, I mean, up until, you know, the liberation or the emancipation or whatever. And we've seen this again and again. I mean, the way that they were treated so appallingly in the First World War, of course, contributed to the revolution. And then, of course, in the Second World War, one of the elements with it behind the mass rapes was simply the way that the soldiers had been so humiliated by their own officers and commissars that they were actually taking out their anger. It was a sort of the knock-on theory of oppression on German, Hungarian, Polish women as they advanced on Berlin in 1945. So all of these things were sort of linked up together. And we see a very similar thing, the way that they're being treated in Ukraine. I mean, when you start calling up 150,000, 300,000, we don't know exactly the figures, of supposedly of those who've actually had some military training. But they're told, oh, we haven't got any kit for you. Basically, they have to buy their own body armor. And they're even told that they're not going to get any bandages or anything like that. So they should get tampons off or sanitary pads off their girlfriends and mothers. I mean, to treat your soldiers in that particular way is very much of a Russian tradition. I remember in the early 1990s, when up to 5,000 conscripts a year were committing suicide. And this was regarded as a joke by the generals. The British ambassador went to visit General Lebed in Siberia. And as soon as he arrived, he came out with his favorite dinner party story, which was how difficult it was in Siberia because they couldn't dig any more graves with the frozen ground. And so they had to wait until there was a thaw. And so they put all the conscripts to work digging more graves. And what did they find? That half of them deserted. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, unbelievable, that sort of mentality.
Yeah. And also the tactics as well. I mean,
yes. Well, I keep on saying, you know, Russia is the one country which is a prisoner of its own past. I mean, they simply cannot. I mean, their obsession with artillery goes back Borodino, of course, and you know, the First World War, and above all, the Second World War, where, you know, artillery was referred to as the god of war. Yeah. And so this is why we're seeing they've got no idea of urban warfare doctrine or anything like that, which the rest of the world has more or less adapted to. But no, the Russians just believe in smashing them to pieces, the city and all the people within it. So very little has changed in that way. And I mean, the whole of the attack on Kiev right at the beginning was straight out of Marshal Zhukov entering Berlin in 1945. With similar disasters, and even this idea of attaching bed springs and iron bedsteads to the front of their tanks, thinking that that would cause premature explosions of the anti-tank guns. And in fact, actually, it gave their position away to the Ukrainian tank hunting parties.
Gosh. So recreating Zhukov's first tank army,
Yes.
that was what they were doing?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So you in your Desert Island Disc, I think you told Kirsty Young that it's very, very dangerous to predict the future, or you use words to that effect. Having said that, would you like to? How do
Rather,
you
I'm afraid a stunning platitude if I did come up with that one.
I've got the actual quote if you want to. It was
apologize.
something like that. But I mean, I think it was a fair point, Age. You talk I think you said that historians talk about the past, but they shouldn't try and predict the future. I think it was something like that.
Well, something like that. But I mean, well, everybody says about Russia, you know, it's the only country where you can't predict the past.
Well, it's very dangerous. Yes, very dangerous to predict the past, isn't it? People have lost their lives doing that. But nevertheless, how do you think? You know, you're a military man yourself as well as a military historian. What do you think is the kind of end game there?
Well, I think it will all depend on Crimea. I mean, Crimea is definitely going to be the sort of crunch point. And that there are now indications that the Americans, and of course, as a result, the British and others too, might be prepared to allow Zelensky to have a go at Crimea itself. Now, from a Russian point of view, that will be existential, which is a great phrase they've been using, because I got it wrong. I mean, I believed that Zelensky was being very clever, that he was going to use the threat against Crimea as a sort of bargaining chip. I was corrected on this by the previous British ambassador in Ukraine. And she said, listen, you know, no, you got it wrong. She said, he is so angry about what they've done to the country or whatever, that he's going for going for Crimea as well as Ukraine to get every single Russian out. So this is going to be the sort of, I think, one of the key elements. The only way, of course, it can end, and this is one of the problems that we're facing in the future. During Cold War I, the Russian and Chinese communist leaders could be relied on for sticking to more or less what they'd said and all the rest of it. Now, all of that's gone. And this is the danger for the future of, frankly, traditional diplomacy. How can you actually come to an agreement when you're dealing with somebody like Putin, who will never stick to anything that he's ever said and completely changing his mind from day to day? So that is, I think, one of the reasons why Zelensky believes that because Putin is so associated with Crimea, I mean, the occupation of the Crimea shot his numbers up to 90% approval rating. The only way to bring Putin down, in fact, is to take Crimea. And maybe, although Biden and the White House have been saying recently, oh, well, we've got to make it sound as if we're prepared to negotiate or whatever to the Ukrainians. As far as Zelensky is concerned, no way. You know, we're going the whole hog.
So when you were a young man with the 11th Hussars at Hone, did you actually ever think you would see Russian tanks in action again in Europe?
No, but we did at that particular time. In 1968, there was even an extraordinary moment when the Bundesgrenzschutz, the German border force, who had old Saladin armored cars with 76mm guns, were there as the Russian tanks rolled in. And this was along a strip where Dubček had told them to take down the wire and all the rest of it. And to give you an idea, you know, the Russian commanders didn't have any maps. Suddenly there was the Bundesgrenzschutz people suddenly saw these Russian tanks coming towards them. They loaded their guns ready to fire, and World War III about to start or whatever. And the little Czech border guard came running along from the side, waving his arm, saying, do you know you're about to invade West Germany? And the Russians sort of had to do an about turn and sort of pull back. But we did actually think we were going to fight at one particular point. Yes,
I was actually in Prague as a 10-year-old with my parents. We navigated out by following all the signs had gone except the ones pointing to Moscow. and they were always on. If you wanted to drive south, you had to have that sign on your left. And so long as all the signs were on the left, Mum and Dad thought we'd get out. Anyway, okay, Anthony, I'm going to one last quote. Okay, one last quote. And so, which book is this? You say, one should not speculate about the mental states of the oppressors, whether they be Nazis, Soviet, or fascist. To do so would be to assume the dubious mantle of a long-distance psychiatrist. Which book was that? Nazi, Soviet, or fascist? I'll give you a slight clue.
Well, I mean, that would obviously I think must have been I suppose, the Spanish Civil War.
It was, yeah.
Yes,
you
yes.
read the Spanish Civil War. So, as a long-distance psychiatrist, I think you're absolutely correct. We shouldn't speculate about the minds of people we don't know. But if you're going to do it, you have to be a historian, and you are absolutely, you're just you're without par excellence, fantastic. And I people must read this book. It's a bit longer than some of your others, but actually, it is brilliant. And
well, it would have been even longer with young Gunstone.
yes, it would. Yeah, well, he does come in, doesn't he? He had a sticky end, didn't he? Did he have a sticky end?
Oh, yes, he had a very sticky end.
Oh,
yes.
good.
Well, I mean, virtually everybody came to a sticky end in one way or another.
Sure,
I mean,
it was an absolute shite, wasn't he?
I think I can only think of one. I can only think of one who actually died in his bed, and that was I'm sorry.
I think Wrangel died in his bed, didn't he? He didn't.
Molotov, I suppose, I think died in his
Molotov
bed.
did, yeah.
Yes, he did.
On the whites, I think Wrangel and Denikin did. They got to Paris.
Wrangel would have died in it. Yes, it's true. Well, what's fascinating is the way that Putin has brought back the bodies of Denikin and of Kappel. Kappel was a good general, but he brought them back. But this was all part of his thing, and it shocked a lot of the Soviet loyalists at the time. You might imagine.
I didn't know he'd done that.
Yeah, and set up monuments to them and all the rest of it. Well, I mean, come on, the inside of the Kremlin now is an absolute memorial to Tsarism. I mean, there's no, and as to the palace on the Black Sea, with all of the double-headed eagles in all directions. But of course, there's a wonderful sort of metaphor, and that is that all the marble has got this mold coming out of it. Isn't it marvelous? You must see the Navalny, if you haven't, the Navalny documentary. It is incredible.
Oh, right. Well, on that optimistic piece that Putin's palace is full of mold, we should thank you so much, and thank you for doing this. And it's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you.